Tonight I picked the topic or the title for this lesson, the words that Jesus spoke in the Treasury. The Greek word for treasury appears once in each of the Gospels. In the Gospel of John, that's where I got that title, because John's account says these words Jesus spoke in the Treasury. But the account in Matthew, the only time the word treasury appears in Matthew's Gospel, is when it tells us that those very particular and pious Jews wouldn't put blood money into the treasury, the 30 pieces of silver. They were too worried about justice and all those good things. They couldn't put blood money into the treasury. But the other two Gospels, in Mark, the 12th chapter, and Luke, the 20th chapter, we have words that were spoken in the treasury. Now, one of the Gospels doesn't say that, but when you look at all the things that are synonymous in both of them, there are 5 different teachings of the Lord that are mentioned in both those Gospels. So I think it's undoubtedly true that he spoke these in the treasury, because one of the things that's common to them is the widow casting her 2 small copper coins into the treasury. So I wanted to take a little time tonight. We got through the Nicanor gate and into the court of the priest in Israel last week, but I want to backtrack now back to the court of the women, talk a little bit tonight about the treasury. It's very interesting, also kind of complicated. I don't know that I know half as much as I should to talk about it, because there's a lot of things that are said that you can read, but there's no explanation, and so you just kind of have to guess. But there are some things that we do know about the collection of funds and money in the temple, and that's what we want to talk about tonight. There were, as probably most of you know, there were 13 chests around the walls of the court of the women that were shaped like trumpets, small at the top, flared at the bottom, so they would hold the coins that were dropped into them. They didn't have any paper money in those days, so you could give an offering and pay your temple taxes, etc., into these 13 chests. They were all numbered, they were all labeled as to what went in. You just couldn't go in and drop your money at the nearest one and leave. And I think it's important to remember the size of this court is about 200 feet square. I think there's a miraculous element. I never thought about it before. But when you think about it, one of the Gospels says that Jesus was sitting where? He was sitting opposite. He was sitting across the court, apparently, from where most of these trumpets that collected the funds were. It says he was sitting opposite the treasury. Now, the human eye, at 200 feet, could you tell what the widow put in? Could you even see it? Especially if she wasn't being ostentatious, so she wasn't doing this, you know. She was putting them in, very unassuming, very small coins. So I think there's a miraculous element here that only Jesus could have known, sitting perhaps 200 feet away, what that, first of all, that she was a widow, and secondly, what she put in, how many, and what they were. I never thought about that before, but I think there has to be some miraculous power exhibited here for Jesus to even be able to say what he did about this woman, that she was a widow and that she put in 2, and the third thing, it was all of her living. So as we look at these 13 trumpets, let's start and first of all label them as what they were, starting with number 1. Number 1 and number 2, these 2 were for paying your temple taxes. Now, and I don't know if there was this distinction made or not, but you could pay last year's taxes if you hadn't, and you could pay this year. That was trumpets 1 and 2. So I assume number 1 was for last year, but I don't know that. So number 1 and 2, that was where you dropped in the money that you were under the law that was paying the temple tax. Number 1 and number 2. Now, when we get to number 3, and this is where perhaps Mary would have put her money in when she brought Jesus to the temple, either number 3 or number 4, because 3 and 4 were used exclusively, again, for women to bring their offering to either buy 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Number 3 was for turtle doves. Number 4 was for pigeons. Now, every evening, every afternoon, sometime during the day, the priest emptied those 2 and made the number of offerings which they found in the bottom of the chest. If one had the money for 10 offerings, then they offered 10 pigeons. If the other had money for 100 doves, they had to come up with 100 doves. So the poor had the choice, of course, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And that money went in to either number 3 or number 4, emptied every day, counted, and the appropriate number of birds then were offered on the altar. So far, that's pretty easy. Let's go now to number 5. Number 5 was now, number 5 and number 6 and number 7. These were voluntary, but again, they were specifically labeled for certain things. Number 5, if you put a contribution in number 5, it went toward the purchase of wood for the altar, to keep the altar burning. Number 6 was toward the purchase of ingredients for making the incense. Incense offering twice a day, and so you could contribute specifically to that. Number 7 was for the purchase of gold vessels that were used in the temple service. So those 3 were voluntary, both as to what you wanted, where you wanted to put it, and what it was used for was specified. Now when we get into Numbers 8 through 13, or 8 through 12, 8 through 12, and this is where it gets difficult, and I tried to find more. Everything I can read about 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 was apparently if you got to the temple, bought the offering which you came to offer on that day, whatever was required of you. You bought the animal, you had money left over. Everything I can read says 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 was for money left over. I don't know if this was it was just an act of piety. Well, I came and lambs were cheap today or whatever, and I have this money left over, I'll put it in the right one. Or if they considered it some sort of obligation. You came with so much in hand, the sacrifice was cheaper that day, and so you had some money left over, so I have to go put it in the appropriate trumpet. I don't know which it is, but on all of these, everything I can read says it was for money left over after you purchased your sacrifice. Well, which was which? Number 4 was for number 5 was for wood. That was voluntary. Okay, get down to number 8. Number 8 was for leftover money from sin offerings. And it always says, the only thing I can read is for leftover money after you bought your sin offering. Number 9, same thing, leftover money from trespass offerings. Number 10, over money from, can't even read my own writing here, from bird, that's bird, leftover money from bird offerings. Number 11 then was different, and it was leftover money from the offerings that a Nazarite had to offer. And of course, if the Nazarite completed his vow, it was very expensive when you're talking about offering several animals. Number 12 was leftover money from the offerings which a cleansed leper had to offer. Now it seems very strange to us. If you planned to offer and you had to offer something, that you just didn't offer it. But these were all specified apparently for leftover money. You bought your offering, it cost less than you expected. Whether you were required or expected to put your leftover money in, or most people just did it, well, I intended to spend this much, and I'll go ahead and spend all of it, even though the offering animal actually cost less. I don't know which is the case. Number 13, the last one. This was different. Number 13, again, was just for voluntary offerings, not specified as to what it would be used for, unlike the others for wood or gold vessels Number 13 was just voluntary. Now, any questions come to mind when we go through that list? Nobody has a question? Okay. Well, then let's go on. There was in the apparently somewhere in the nearby area, there was a special chamber where they emptied the chests every day, did the accounting, and then, of course, the requisite number of animals or birds would be offered. So there was a special chamber for that. There was another chamber which was called the Chamber of the Silent. If you were pious, you had a very large offering, maybe something so big, a gold nugget or something that wouldn't even go in the chest. If you were not wanting to make a show of things, you went to the Chamber of the Silent, and there you could deposit secretly a very large contribution without anyone knowing. And that's why it was a Chamber of the Silent, unlike some, of course, that blew the trumpet before them. And some commentators have suggested that phrase, Christ talks about people, Pharisees blowing the trumpet before them, that it may be an allusion to the fact that these chests were shaped like, and the Jews called these chests trumpets because of the shape. They actually called them trumpets. So Christ may be saying these people are so ostentatious, it's like they went into the temple and picked up one of those chests, and carried it before them to show their great offering that they're making, and a big show, a big play, so people could see them. But that was about all I can find about the treasury, except one other thing. At some time, apparently, this Chamber of the Silent, if there were poor children, devout Jews, apparently later on, this chamber was used for the education of poor children that otherwise would not have been taught. Perhaps they were gifted, I don't know, would have been taught the law, that their parents could not afford to educate them. But this was used for the education at some time, for the education of poor children. Comments, questions? The commentators say, that the treasury, there was so much money came to the temple that it was kind of like a national bank. I think I said that a couple of weeks ago. But there was a lot of money flowing into this one place. Yes, Carol.
You were saying that the amount that they would buy depending on how much money was in the offering. Was that dependent on how was that decided? About how they wanted it to change?
How much an offering cost, is that what you're asking?
Right.
Well, I think it was probably market conditions. There could be during the feast, there could be maybe so many people there, their supply was limited and the price went up. On the other hand, a lot of people might have brought a lot of animals to town expecting more people than showed up, and the price went down, and so you were expecting market price to be this, you got there, it's cheaper, and you have this money left over, so you go put it in the appropriate chest in the treasury. Yeah. The price of animals was apparently just a market-driven thing. I don't think there was any. But of course, Jesus talks about a den of thieves and robbers. There was a lot of that going on, we know, especially when they had to change their ordinary money for acceptable money to be given in the temple. There was a chance there to really gouge people and really make a large profit. And Jesus says, a den of thieves and robbers. And so we know something was going on like that in the temple precincts, probably in the royal portico, which was kind of like an open-air market in many respects, apparently. Another question. Gary.
You mentioned the money for kids who were having problems or didn't have parents.
Or poor. It just said.
Did it say who taught those kids?
No. Of course, it would be a lawyer or a rabbi or something, would teach them. It wasn't like a school. Apparently, it was more directed toward teaching them the law. You know, Paul apparently came from a very wealthy family. He grew up being taught by Gamaliel, you know, at the top of, you know, going to Harvard as far as, you know, learning about the law. But if you had poor families, of course, couldn't afford anything like that. And so all I could find is they used that chamber for teaching the children of the pious poor that for some reason wanted their children instructed in the law in detail. Any other questions? Okay, let's then, I guess we'll leave the treasury and go back. If you have your drawing, there's still some on the back if you don't have one. Let's continue our forward march into the court of the priest. Now last week we went through the Nicanor gate. We talked about the chamber of Phineas, which is on the right as you went in. The chamber of the pancake makers was somewhere on the left. And now we're going to go counterclockwise around the court, starting with the gate there. The first gate you see in green, remember in my code, green is a gate. There were 3 on each side that went into this area. And so the first green gate is called and don't ask me why, it's called the Flame, F-L-A-M-E if you can read it, the Flame Singer's Gate, or on some old accounts it's called the Spark Singer's Gate. Now I tried to find out why this gate was called that and what does it mean. Apparently there was a fire kept burning here all the time. For whatever purpose, I don't know, unless in case they needed fire to start a fire someplace, they would not get the fire from the altar if it was for profane, non-sacred purposes. They kept a fire going here, I guess, like we would keep a pilot light. But it's called the Flame Singers or the Spark Singers Gate. So it had something apparently to do also with the Levitical singers. Now, one thing I didn't mention as we talked about going through the Nicanor gate, there were underground chambers. You're going up, remember the Nicanor gate, you have to go up 13 steps up to the court of Israel. And so 13 steps at half a cubit, so that's 7.5 feet, 6.5 feet. There are underground chambers that are there under the court of Israel, which belong to the Levitical singers. And there were apparently ways coming up into the court of the women there under the colonnade on the west side that led from those underground chambers. And so that may, because there were rooms for the singers, the musicians, maybe they kept their instruments down there. That may be why this first gate on the north side here is called the Singer's Gate. And why they kept the fire there, I don't know, except they apparently did. One of those things you read and there's no explanation, probably because nobody knows at this point why it was called that. So that's the first gate. Now, you notice I have a note under it. This was above it. It was not a single-story gate. Above this gate was the guard chamber where part of the temple guard, apparently these were their quarters, above this gate. You'll find the same thing on the opposite side above one of the gates over there when we get around to the south side of the court. But there were guards, and I found a list and how they posted guards. They posted very few guards. I don't know if they had in reserve as far as just at the gates. Each gate to the Temple Mount and had one guard, one priest, or one Levite on duty during the night, and apparently at least maybe two shifts. But they didn't have a bunch of guards, but they probably had some way in case there was a problem to wake up the reserves and get them to the point where they needed. But we know guards were stationed in above these two gates here in the court of the priests. The next room then, the blue room between that gate and the next gate, this is called the Parva salting chamber. Parva was the man who built it. This chamber, it says, a man named Parva built this chamber. Now, why is it a salting chamber? Because when they stripped the skin, flayed the skin off the sacrificial animal, it was washed and it was brought to this chamber and salted, because it would be saved and sold or used for making leather. And so the first step, apparently, to keep it from rotting, spoiling, was to wash it and to then salt the skin down to preserve it to be used for making leather. And somebody named Parva built this chamber for this purpose. And so this is the first then room where there's not a gate, but it is thought, you would bring the sacrificial animal skins in, and you would expect, you didn't want to traipse back through the courtyard, and it's thought that all these secondary chambers may have had gates or doors out. They weren't public gates, but there were doors, and the video that we saw, the very fast short video last week, shows these chambers as having doors, because they would bring the skins in, salt them, and then take them out and get them out of the holy area when they were salted down and be carried off and sold to tanners or whatever. So that was the salting chamber. Now we have another gate, and this is the gate, of course, which I was wrong about a year ago when I said, well, women don't go into the court of the priest, but they did. This is called the offering and the women's gate, and a man or a woman. And remember, some sacrifices required what? When the animal was slain, the one that was being slain on whose behalf had to put their hand on its head. And so if you were a woman bringing a sacrifice that required that you have your hand on the animal's head, you had to come into this area. And this area here on the north side of the altar is called the slaughterhouse, because that's what they did there. And so this gate is just in the right place to come in, whether a man or a woman. And as I said last week, there was a door somewhere in this wall between the court of Israel and the court of the women, where people coming in wouldn't go through the Nicanor gate. They could on the side go through the door and get back into the court of the women. So this was the offering and the women's gate. Now we have another blue room between the two gates again. This is called the rinsing chamber, and as you would suspect, when the animal was slain, its blood was drained, the skin is off of it and taken to be salted. The sacrificial parts of the animal were taken into this chamber and rinsed before and prepared to be offered on the altar. The part of it that was going to be offered was first rinsed, washed, and I think it was also the offering was salted there also. Seemed like I read that someplace. So that's that chamber. Now, passing that, we come to the Jeconiah, or the Beth Moked gate. Okay, we can understand that Jeconiah is the name. Beth Moked means the house of stoves, or the house of the hearth. And it's called that because that great big blue rectangle right above it is the chamber of the stoves. So this is the reason that gate got that name. Now let's go to the chamber of the stoves right above it. There are two things immediately that you notice. The first is how big it was. It stuck out past the holy area out into actually into the court of the Gentiles. And it was a very big chamber. This chamber actually, the main room was domed. It had a dome for a roof. So it was very big, and I think it was Josephus said that this chamber, at least the main part of it, was built up on arches. So the colonnade here may not have been columns along this part. There may have been actually arches holding up the wall of this chamber. So there was some of it, at least, was upstairs. It was very big. It had a dome. And this was the place where the priests that were on duty slept. Now, I read two different stories about that. The first thing I read said that the leader of the shift, the priest served for 1 week. The leader of the course got to sleep here. But later on, I read the whole course of priests, however many were slept in this huge chamber at night for the 1 week that they were there in the temple. It had a very large dining room. This is where they eat while they're working. they're 1 week in the temple. They have to, and so it had a dining room, apparently had sleeping facilities, and it's called the house or the chamber of hearths or the chamber of stoves, because remember we talked about last week when the priest went to serve, he took off his leather sandals and served barefoot, and so they, at least in the wintertime, they kept a fire going here in the wintertime because the priest would come in after serving, and especially think it'd be bad in the daytime of the winter, but at night, the evening sacrifice would come in after the evening sacrifice or in the daytime when it's cold, and could warm themselves, so a fire was kept burning here all the time. So this is called the chamber of hearths or the chamber of stoves. Now, and you can't see the detail. And I realized after I did it, I did a lot of detail that do not show. But notice there are 4 squares in the chamber of stoves, and each corner there's a little room indicating something in each corner. Now we're going to start on the lower right. The lower right, during the time that Antiochus Epiphanes had control of the temple, we know he offered swine's flesh. The Jews took all the stones of the altar that were profaned by the swine's blood and kept them through the years and put them into this room, in this northeast corner. So this is the room of the profaned, the polluted stones that had been touched by the swine's blood that the Greeks had offered on the altar of burnt offerings. And so it's called the room of the stones. Interesting thing. They're just rocks, but they had been on the altar of God, and they kept them, even though they were polluted. Right above it, in the north, on the north side there, on the northwest side, that is the room for the priest's bath. And it said that it was very large and well lit, and the temple is amazing because they didn't use stairs. So many places where we would put stairs, they just put a trap door and a ladder. The lavatory, if you had to go and you're a priest, was through a trap door and a ladder down below. The bath apparently was above it. And so this is the restroom facility for the priests and the week and that they're serving in the temple and here in this area where they stayed. Now if we move across to the south there, on the south side, that they always kept 6 lambs there ready for the sacrifice at all times. They kept 6 perfect lambs ready to be sacrificed, and so this you would expect if this dining room and everything was upstairs, that the rooms like where the lambs were kept would have been at least on that room would have been on the ground floor and probably open to the colonnade outside. But they're always ready, and we come back around to the left lower room. That room was the room where the showbread was made for the temple. So we have the pancake makers up by the Nicanor gate. We have the showbread being made in the large area that we just call the chamber of the stoves or the chamber of the hearth. Question?
Back on the Greeks offering swine, were they doing that in the temple?
Yes, Antiochus Epiphanes profaned the temple by offering pigs.
And was that earlier or just intermingled with the Israelites?
Well, it was during the time between the Testaments, okay, when the Seleucids were in control and Jerusalem was under the Seleucid Empire.
Well, it wasn't a continuous thing then.
No, it was just a one-time thing. And of course, the Maccabee rebellion kicked the Seleucids out, and they rededicated the temple. Hence, the Feast of the Dedication, to celebrate the rededication of the temple after it had been polluted. But they removed all those stones that had been at least touched by the pig's blood and had been. They may have had to take. I don't know if they took the whole altar down or what, but all the stones were removed and never used again. But they weren't just thrown out in the field. They were stored here like you'd store something really valuable, and they had no value, but it was because they had been used in offering sacrifice to God, and so they considered them holy. Somewhat maybe superstitious, but it was still something they did. You know, a rock is a rock, but these were special rock. Anybody else? Okay, let's now keep going counterclockwise and go over to the south side there on the corner. That gate is the wood gate, and that's where wood was brought in for the temple service. Now, we talked about last week, way down in the corner, on the opposite corner, it's kind of strange, whether this was just called that or just as a title. But if you're going to bring the wood in there and then you're going to take it clear down to the opposite corner of the temple to sort it out and get the wormy wood out so it doesn't get used on the altar. But it was called the wood gate. And so apparently they used it for that purpose because the chamber right under it is what? It's another storage area for wood. So whether they kept the working wood up there and the wood stored in the court of the women was just emergency supply if they couldn't bring in more, I don't know. But they had at least these two places where they stored wood to keep the altar burning regardless of the weather or whatever. So that's the chamber of wood. Now, if you remember, one more gate next. The next gate is called the firstlings gate. What did they do with the first fruits of the crop in the fall when it came in? Who the first fruits belong to? Belong to God, right? And so this was called the first fruits. And so apparently they kept the symbolism by naming one specific gate and bringing, as they brought the first fruits in to offer them, bringing them through this gate. They called it the first fruits, or the firstings gate. Now, during the, if you go back and look, and I hope you could look on the internet of the video last week, because you remember in one very fleeting shot, there's a room with it, looks like a machinery. Well, it was machinery. This is called the Gola chamber, and that was the waterworks. That was the pumping mechanism that pumped water into the temple to fill the laver, and of course, I assume, to also get to pump water into the slaughterhouse area to wash it down at night, or however frequently they washed it. But they had a pumping mechanism to bring the water. Remember, early on we talked about there were about 50 miles of conduits that came from the Judean hills that brought water into the temple area to supply it and to supply Jerusalem. But this was the pumping chamber. And it's called the Gola room, and I don't know what the word means. Maybe it means pump. I don't know. But that was what that room was. Oh, our timing is good. Now, we have one more gate to go, and this is called the water gate. This third gate on the south side is called the water gate. Next week, I'm going to take a little time and talk about what went on during the Feast of Booths. It's called the water gate because during the Feast of Booths, the priest took a golden pitcher before the start of the feast, on the first day of the feast, early in the morning, and went out that ceremonial east gate, down the pilgrim's path. By the way, if you look on the internet, they've just uncovered part of it that led up to the east gate there. They just they're digging it up probably as we speak. Just recently, they've uncovered part of that pilgrim's path. They went out that east gate, down the pilgrim's path to the pool of Siloam. And there they filled that golden pitcher, and it was supposed to last for the 7 or 8 days of the Feast of Booths. And we'll talk about next week what they did with that water, as we talk a little bit about that feast and the Lord attending one of them and what the Gospels say about that. But that's the water gate, and that was where that pitcher always came back into the temple through that gate, and was used. And the Feast of Booths is the only time where there is a water sacrifice. You know, we always have the animal sacrifices. We have the grain, the pancakes that the pancake makers made. We have the grain. We have the wine, the drink offerings. But the Feast of Booths is the only festival in which water was offered in sacrifice, which is kind of interesting. I didn't know that. Now, the red chamber, and we'll finish up. This is called the Chamber of Hewn Stones. It was called that because apparently in constructing it they used iron implements which they would not have used on the sanctuary or anything like that. Up until and about the time of Christ, this is where the great Sanhedrin met. It, like the chamber of the hearth chamber, the chamber of stones on the other corner, it also stuck out past the holy area, if not into the profane area, at least close. And I don't know how, we don't know how, except it was partially, apparently, at least to the steps or something out into the regular area of the temple. And that's where the great Sanhedrin met. If you had a problem, of course, there would be a small Sanhedrin at the gate into the court of the women, and your problem, they couldn't solve it, then it went to the small group of 23 that met near the Nicanor gate. But the great Sanhedrin, the council of the Jews, met in this room up until about the time of Christ. About the time of Christ, somewhere along in there, some rabbi decided that no one could sit within the holy area, and some of it at least is in the holy area. No one could sit within the holy area except a descendant of David. Why all this time? Somebody had a revelation, but somebody made that decision, and they moved the great Sanhedrin to another room in the temple. But up until about the time of Christ, this is where they met. When exactly they moved it, I don't know. And that pretty well finishes the court.